Welcome everyone back to Bright Orange Future after a bit of a hiatus here for the last 10 weeks or so. I think our last show was with Maddie Case up in Seattle on August 13th. I have my big brother, Matt Garrity, on the line.
Yes, you do. Hi, everybody. Great to be here. Hi, bro.
Hey.
Glad to be recording again.
Yeah, me too. So it's been a wild couple of months for Bitcoin getting started with a bull market. Lots of things going on there. Lots of things going on in the world. Election next week. I think we'll probably drop this episode on Monday, so the election will be like the next day. That's going to be nuts. We have an incredible guest today that I'm really excited about. I'm a big fan of her writing on the Bitcoin and crypto space, but she also has a long career outside of that space, and we'll get into that a little bit. And I think she's recently taken a new step, so we'll learn about that. It's Leigh Cuen. Most Bitcoiners know her as one of the top reporters on Bitcoin, writing for CoinDesk the last few years. So we'll bring her in 5 or 10 minutes. But first, Matt, why are you wearing a hat?
Why am I wearing a hat?
Let's get into it. Yeah.
Matt in a hat. Yeah. Well, the reason we really had to take this hiatus is I got diagnosed with glioblastoma stage 4, which is brain cancer, and was rushed into surgery and had brain surgery. Really like a couple weeks after our last podcast, I think. The timeline starts to get a little foggy in my head. But anyway, the timing is not that important. I have been, since the surgery, I've been put on a chemotherapy, and I'm doing radiation therapy. And that's a 6-week prescription, which is almost over. So
last day tomorrow.
Last day is tomorrow. And I'm feeling pretty chipper about things. My spirits are high. I've had incredible support from the Seattle community and people and friends and family, and I'm well taken care of.
I got a funny little anecdote there.
Okay.
Your friends put up a GoFundMe page, and I was thinking, like, with a lot of things, I was like, oh, I'm going to have to like edit this and like promote this and market this thing. And I looked back like 2 days later, and it was like 2x the goal.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, right. Of course, everybody recognizes the same things in my brother that I always have. Of course, they would jump at that opportunity. So that was just heartwarming and awesome and great.
Thanks, brother. It was, and it's one of the funny things about this is like you're just very emotionally open, you know, and so it's just like every card I get or these donations that have come in, I just find myself like just almost in tears because it's just so beautiful, you know, like it's just been very heartwarming. It makes this process so much easier, and I feel lucky and full of gratitude to have this support, and I hope others that are going through what I have similar support systems, because it could be very lonely and scary otherwise, and I don't feel that. I feel optimistic, and like I said, my spirits are high, and I'm excited to be, I've been staying busy. I've been writing music. I'm recording a new project. And so I've been in the studio in the evenings, and which has been really important to just not feel like I'm not doing anything, because I've had to like cut out a lot of my activities, So having that studio project has been another shot in the arm of just being able to be my favorite part of myself is just being a musician and writing and being with the guys in the studio, and that's been wonderful. Looking forward to sharing some of that.
It seems music. Like you've gotten most of the band back together.
Get the band back together, baby.
Like you're all like 10 years older, but everybody's actually, it appears to be better musicians than they were 10 years ago.
It's crazy. It's so true. everything's flowing. Everything's different now too. It's like finding just the technology and everything is advanced. Is the last time I've been in the studio, so you can do even more cool stuff, and it's been really, really fun.
Yeah, well, I think you need to shout out a few of the people involved.
Yeah, I've got Zach Malang, who's a great bass player, and also a budding studio engineer and producer. And I've got Kimo Meraki on lead guitar, banjo.
Aren't there like 11 more?
Mandolin, Chinese harp, whatever instrument that you've never heard before. Kimo's played it, and he's playing it.
I'm partial to the slide guitar. With
that slide guitar is really cool. He's got this Rickenbacker lap steel. Sorry, Rickenbacker laptop would be sweet. But if you're a guitar geek, or if you know anything, you know Rickenbackers are really sweet and kind of classic. And he's got this lap steel guitar that just makes the sweetest sound I've ever heard, and that's what Cory's talking about. We recently had a little get together up in Leavenworth, which is up in the mountains here close by, and
some nice property in the north up there.
Some property in the north, and we did some concerts and some performances up there, just with close friends and family. And Cory came up for that. That was really cool. But yeah, that's the update of what's going on with me. So,
man, I drove through the fires of hell. That was like the worst of the West Coast wildfires. I drove all the way through Oregon without stopping. I got gas like in Northern Cali and didn't stop until Southern Washington. It was ridiculous.
Your run was amazing. And, it was great. It's like, I don't know how long it took for you to hear that what I was going through, and like you were making plans to get up here right away, which was awesome because I needed you.
Yeah.
And
yeah. Well, I remember your birthday was August 9th. You went to the hospital on the 19th, and then the surgery was the 21st.
Mm-hmm.
So it was all pretty quick.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, listen, it's awesome. I'm glad. I mean, you've been bugging me to get back on and do this for a few weeks, but I was like, let's just give it a minute, make sure everything's fine. And I knew that we had this great convo coming up with Leigh on the calendar already. So I'm thrilled that we're restarting Bright Orange Future with Leigh. I think that we should bring her right in. Let's see here. Okay, I've unmuted you, Leigh. Now you also have to unmute. And,
all right, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. I'm unmuted. Hey, everybody.
Yeah. Hi, Leigh.
It's Leigh.
I have to say, listening to you talk about this experience, I'm really curious to hear how it has, or maybe it hasn't at all, impacted the way that you view Bitcoin, considering that a lot of people view Bitcoin as something that they want to bequeath to their family, and they see it as something with long-term value. And as you suddenly grapple with some of the issues of mortality that we all face, has it changed your perspective on Bitcoin at all? Sorry, I just jumped right in with a question.
You realize you're the subject of the interview today, Leigh.
You know what? I love it.
That's great.
We're talking to a journalist today.
We're talking to a journalist. This is going to be the Leigh Cuen show with Matt and Cory as the guests. I love it.
Great question, because I have thought about it a lot, and going through just doing a will, doing all of these things, and if anything, I've just become more bullish on the idea of what Bitcoin represents, and wanting to make sure that I have some to give to my children, or get them set up for themselves. Really, they're the future. They're the ones that are going to be using Bitcoin, and it's not going to, like, I've got a daughter who's 12, or who's 11, I'm sorry. I keep thinking she's 12 because she's so mature, but she's 11. And it is on my mind, Yeah. I've got excitement for it, though. I feel like, I've been watching this and considering it much more seriously in the last couple of years, but also the last 4 or 5 years, I've been aware of it and been extremely optimistic about its uses, you know.
Little known
Yeah,
fact,
really
my
lucky.
brother actually had Bitcoin before I did. We just
What?
didn't talk about it until I got into the space.
Ooh, you're the smarter brother then. You
I
have to
am the
catch up.
luckier brother, Leigh. I won some Bitcoin on a poker site
Ooh,
and took my winnings in Bitcoin. And so I
very
actually
cool.
technically had a little Bitcoin before, but it was my first good move that I made on the poker table in a long time, was getting my money out of there and get it on. Yeah.
All right, but
guys are really
we got to
lucky.
take control of this, Matt. We got to
Sorry.
take back our show.
Oh,
Lee, for people who don't know you, just give us a little bit about your background and what you're up to, and just kind of introduce yourself to our audience a little bit.
Yeah, so hi everybody. You guys know I'm Lee. I've been a journalist for a pretty long time. I started my first internship at a paper newspaper in high school, and I studied journalism in college. I moved to Israel when I was 22 to work as a foreign correspondent. I covered a lot of things related to the Syrian civil war, to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, also just a lot of different culture topics. As a freelancer, especially as a young freelancer in a heavily saturated market, which the Middle East is heavily saturated with foreign correspondents, I just had to take basically any topic someone would throw at me. And I was really lucky that around 2015, an editor assigned me a piece about Bitcoin, but it wasn't really about Bitcoin. It was about darknet markets, and Bitcoin was a tiny, tiny side note. So I became aware of it at the time, and I found it really, really, really interesting. And I started thinking about it a lot, but I wasn't really interested in buying drugs or some of the more explicit porn, which is what I was researching it related to. So I didn't even think to look for other people that might be interested in Bitcoin. I thought, oh, they're all interested in that stuff that I don't really need. And so if we flash forward a little bit to like 2017, I had moved to New York and I was working for Newsweek Media Group, so the same company that owns Newsweek Magazine and also International Business Times and a few other publications. And they needed a blockchain reporter. I was the newest reporter being hired onto the staff, so I was the only one that didn't have a set beat yet. And they asked me if I could cover this. And I very clearly remember being like, oh, like a chain of blocks, blockchain, I can figure that out. I had no idea what I was talking about. And that was early 2017. So things very quickly went bonkers. And I found it fascinating how difficult it was to do my job because I had all these years of experience before crypto, maybe like 7 years of reporting, and in some pretty difficult situations, right? Like I was used to covering refugee issues. I was used to covering issues related to human rights and international conflict. So I was used to complicated and even contentious issues. And even for me, fact checking these articles was just an Olympic sport. And so that made me really excited and want to do more of it. Because first off, that means editors will give you a little bit more leeway because you'll be like, look, I need the time to do XYZ. And they can't argue with you because they have no idea what you're talking about. Blockchain data, what's that? Like you're saying that something on Etherscan doesn't match? Like they have no ability to know what you're saying. So you have to figure it out. And I really like the challenge of having to figure things out with every news story, how to verify things. So 3 years later, I'm still doing it.
That's awesome. Yeah, it was really obvious from seeing the first few pieces that I saw of yours that you were actually a journalist and not just a cheerleader and not somebody that just kind of like fell into it. I think I mentioned that I went to Mizzou and have a journalism undergrad and was a really crappy failed local TV reporter at one point.
But I mean, you understand the industry, you understand how it goes.
And I was like you, I started writing in freshman year of high school for local papers and things like that. So I really, that was my initial training. And it was clear you held yourself to certain standards and you were a skeptic. And you wouldn't just like kowtow to the Bitcoin maximalists on Twitter. You'd spar with them a little bit and stand up for yourself. Yeah. And, so I think we probably, you don't have to go look it up, but I think our first couple interactions were like mildly contentious.
That's totally fine.
But then we got into DMs and started chatting and I was like, oh, okay, she's one of the good ones. So it's great to come full circle a year and a half later and have you here.
Yeah, thank you.
So what are you up to now? Did I see that you are sort of launching a new business? Is that next to what you've been doing with CoinDesk, or did you go independent, or what's up?
Yeah, so I'm freelancing now. I'll still be freelancing for CoinDesk, so you still might see my byline there. I still might help out with events or things like that. But I went completely freelance. I think it's almost, I went October 1st. So it's been almost a month now. And as someone who used to be a freelance reporter for a living, I can't even express in words how aware I was of that being a risky move. It's a very risky move in a pandemic to leave a staff job. And I really respect the work that CoinDesk is doing, and I will continue to work with them. So it has nothing to do with CoinDesk not being up to par. It has to do more with, I'm doing a lot of side projects, and it started to become difficult to do a good job to do those projects and my full-time job. And I was just not being able to give my full attention to either. And although I do not think this is a wild career change in which I'm going to get very rich and I'll never go back to staff again. Like maybe I'll go back to working on staff in a few years. I do think that there's a unique opportunity right now that I wanted to take advantage of. So I went freelance, and that means that I've been doing a lot of different things. So some of it is still classic reporting, you know, working with magazines and traditional news outlets, doing coverage that has absolutely nothing to do with Bitcoin. And that's been really good to help get my portfolio a little bit updated. An issue that I noticed right away was I would go to approach editors and they see all these Bitcoin clips for the past 3 years. And it's still kind of considered this really kooky, weird, cultish Wild West. And they're like, oof, we don't know, you know, like, are you even, I have to convince them, like, actually, no, this is a technology that can be taken seriously. There are certainly people who don't, but you can take it seriously. And like XYZ, here's how to take it seriously. So I do some mainstream reporting now in terms of developing relationships with those editors again and showing them I know what I'm talking about. Some of it is also, though, in the crypto space. So I've developed all this expertise that mainstream outlets don't really want to hire me to report on yet. They're curious, but very skeptical. And there's this huge community full of people that very much want to have quality reporting. But I can't, even to a crypto publication, I can't pitch some of the things that would be very useful to people. It's just not going to generate traffic. It will be very useful to people, but that doesn't mean it's a marketable product, if that makes sense.
What's an example of that?
Yeah. So for example, one company hired me to write a kind of guide, and that is not only related to Bitcoin and not only related to their product, but understanding those products in the broader context of the different kinds of tools that people in this category can use, this particular marginalized community. So like, okay, if we wanted to reach out to this marginalized community and have them understand like, hey, Bitcoin is good for this, but you probably still shouldn't do it for illegal things because, you know, blockchains are public receipts. That's information that's super useful and exists somewhere on the web, but the people who need it won't look in the places it exists. So we need it in a language that they speak, in a place that they can find it. And that's not really something that would be marketable to like Fortune magazine, but it might be worthwhile to a few hundred people whose lives it could really change if they had this information and understood it. So I can work with that company in order to write this educational guide and have a very specific contract that shows I'm not endorsing their product and I'm not recommending any kind of financial advice. I'm just showing what tools exist and what kind of context people do use them in and what things you need to know about them that maybe some people get wrong. And that's been a really fun example. A few other examples of specific contracts might be editing creative work. So a lot of people in this space, a lot of Bitcoiners like to write essays and stories, and they want this to be able to reach an audience that isn't highly technical. So getting that editorial guidance and feedback and really working with the writer one-on-one is a great way to help make their story both technically correct and widely accessible. And a third example is there's a crypto project that just genuinely wants to know, like, are we unique at all in this space? We think we are, but are we? And so I would report on it the same way that I would report on any topic if I was hired as a reporter. You know, like, who's paying money for this, who's getting money from this, how is it being used, how is the network actually being run, who's in charge of that network, and like asking and answering all of these basic questions. And what they're paying for is not an endorsement from me, and what they're paying for is not marketing material from me. It's for me to give an objective report on their company. Yeah, so that's like examples.
That's super interesting. Yeah, so would you actually write content for a company like in the voice of an executive, or like put something out on their platform potentially? Or is it also, or is it mostly just like market analysis, like company competitor type research almost?
So I do it on a case-by-case basis. I'm trying to avoid copywriting and branded content, although I've certainly been approached for that. Not because there's anything wrong with it, but I think that would make it really complicated for me if I go back then as a reporter and want to cover the company for an outlet. So traditionally, and I don't even have to explain this to you because you know the journalism world, there's been this really unauthentic divide, at least in our context, between the reporter and the subject. And we're supposed to be completely separate, and we're not supposed to have anything connecting us. But in reality, and especially in a space like this, anyone who has enough information to do a good job reporting on it, they probably own some, or maybe they were involved in a project of some kind. And so it's really complicated to figure out who can objectively report on a thing and do it well enough and understand it well enough. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So,
we had that conversation. You probably know of Billy Bambro from Forbes.
Yeah, exactly.
And the guy's, he knows a lot about Bitcoin, and he's been writing about it for like 4 years, and he refuses to own any, even though he's a huge fan, because he doesn't want it to bias him. I'm like, that's the one you can probably get away with, because it's just money and it's decentralized, and like there's no founder, there's no owner. Like, Billy, you got to like think deeply about not owning Bitcoin and whether that's the right thing for you and your family long term.
I get that, but I try not to own too much Bitcoin. But that's a thing, right? Like, you want to not be biased about the thing you're reporting on. So I try and do it on a case by case basis, and to write specific contracts or agreements that make it very clear, like, where our relationship ends. Because I don't want people to think like, oh, well, she did user research for us and figuring out what our users need, so that means we can put on the website that Leigh endorses our product. Because I definitely want to try and retain as much as I can being a slightly independent critic in the space.
Yep.
But I do all kinds of things in addition to like user research or things like that. I also sell poems, and I sell like creative projects. And that's really fun. Like, one Bitcoiner wrote me, and he has a character in an opera he really likes. He loves this opera. And he's like, I want you to write like basically like a fan fiction in poetic verse about this character that I love. And I did, and he was really happy with it. And I got Bitcoin for it. So all around, it was a pleasant experience. And it's not something that would have really been available through any kind of provider right now when it comes to content.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, we've been making a joke for a while about how Bitcoin Twitter basically disintermediates PR.
Yeah.
And it also probably disintermediates headhunting for people that are actually working in the space. It's just the number one prereq is you have to be super into Bitcoin, or like you really just can't work on these things together. So we end up just, connecting. You just see everybody booking like in public. They'll book their guests, and they'll say, I want to meet blank and have them on a show. And then like someone closer to that person will retweet it and mention them and drag them in. And then all of a sudden these matchups happen. And then, with hiring, like my company, I think, 8 out of 9 people have come from Twitter.
Yeah. Twitter is one of the best marketing platforms for Bitcoin, and also for things like sex workers. A lot of industries that don't have that traditional pipeline, Twitter has become that pipeline, for sure.
Yeah, it's wild. So have you been following the hearings with the 3 big
no
tech companies? Okay, no, it's fine. We were just Google and Facebook and Twitter were on Capitol Hill, or at least by Zoom or WebEx or whatever the government uses yesterday. But if you weren't following it, no big deal. Maddie, what's on your mind?
I'm curious about just when you said sex workers. I have a friend who is very much an advocate for sex workers in Seattle, and she's really pro-woman, pro-feminist, I want to be in charge of, you know, how I go about, and there's a lot of stigma against it. And, you know, the whole word, you know, it's so much more than just sex, what's going on, you know, it's just, it's a legit and very much in demand profession, you know, and I just find her interesting because she's really smart and she's very much, you know, into these issues. And I didn't realize that you had a background kind of covering some of that, or it sounds like you did. And maybe I wonder if there's a tie-in with Bitcoin there as well, in terms of, you know, taking payments in Bitcoin, or, you know, that world.
Yeah, definitely. So I've been reporting on the sex industry for roughly 6 years, 5-6 years now. And I have to say that I come from a really conservative family. And when I started reporting on the beat, I would probably be considered very conservative in my perspective. I was very judgmental about porn in general. I thought it was something that should be avoidable at best. And I have to say that my reporting in the space completely changed my perspective on it.
Really?
There are certainly situations which people are doing that they don't want to do, which is the same for all jobs. There are people that are flipping burgers that don't want to be flipping burgers. But I've met so many women who are safely and independently conducting a profession that previously subjected them to a lot of unfair discrimination and power dynamics, and earning amazing money, not bonkers money, you know, not like millionaire, but like money that puts their kids through college, money that pays off their mortgage, that have a lot more freedom in their jobs than anything else that would have been available to them. And it changed my perspective seeing a lot of these women. And a lot of them were people that first helped me understand Bitcoin, because they're some of the earliest adopters, people who get discriminated against by banks, by payment platforms like PayPal. So there's a lot of reasons that they turn to using Bitcoin, both for savings and for, as you were saying, for transactions, you know, for receiving gifts or receiving tributes digitally. Yeah, that's a thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. And then the other thing that really got me excited about you was learning that you were a poet. I am a big fan of poetry and have written poetry myself, just for fun and for my friends. You know, usually I usually have to be kind of inebriated before I read my poem.
I can relate to that.
I don't know, can you really? Yeah. I remember being in my late teens, early 20s, and just decided, you know, hanging out with friends, and we were all talking as you do when you're young about like what's your dream, about what you want to do, you know, and all this stuff. And I just remember saying like, I want to make movies that are full of poetry, you know. I want to meld movies and poetry and to make these films that are full of poems. And I don't know, you know, I don't even know what I was talking about, but it sticks in my head, you know, that moment. How do you have, when you say you write poetry, and do you like to read it aloud to people, or is it more something that you not perform?
I can read one for us if we want.
Poetry reading, poetry. Yes.
It's not generally something I do, but I like you guys, so I can.
Oh,
all right.
I was hoping we could charm you into it. I don't know, you know.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
So if you want, I can read a poem in particular that I wrote about Bitcoin. I felt like it was on theme to bring that one. I can tell you the story before or after. Which one do you prefer?
Art first, interpretation later.
Gotcha.
Right.
Let's do it. Okay. So
I'm putting on the reaction shots, so we're on gallery view now. Okay.
Oh, good.
Awesome. Okay. So this is called Open Source. Come, open your heart like a door. Merge without judgment. We're all here to dance for the beloved. Wise men know how to laugh, twirl, and forgive. Why do you wait on the sidelines, haggling with your fear over some silly price? The gates are unlocked. Inside, rivers of wine flow between smiles. Your beloved is already dancing. Eternity is a perfect time for you to join.
Wow.
Thank you.
Wow.
That's nice. That's nice. I
Did I catch
aspire
a-
to be one of those wise men.
That was cool.
Right?
Did I catch
Yeah.
did I catch a whirling dervish reference in there?
Yeah, a little bit. Exactly. So this is very much influenced by Hafiz and Rumi, the ancient
Yeah.
Sufi poets that wrote in Persian. They're kind of my favorite. I like them a lot.
Yeah. Well, so we may have talked point, but one of my dear friends is a guy in New York named Matt Ruby. He's also my co-author on the book that we have coming out, which is done. We're just doing illustrations now, called Bright Orange Future. And he also is a longtime rock musician, and then quit and hung up the guitar and became a stand-up comic, which he's been doing for 10 years in New York. And he also ghost wrote a couple of those books for David Heinemeier Hansson and Jason Fried. So like Rework and one of the other ones. Great guy. Huge Rumi fan. Officiated my wedding in Istanbul back in 2012 and read a Rumi poem at it. And then all the Persians and the Turks got in a huge argument over where Rumi is from, because he's a Persian from Anatolia.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
they both claim him, which was
That's really funny.
really fun. But yeah, that was beautiful, Leigh. That was really nice.
Thank you. I'm really jealous of you guys that you seem to be very comfortable in front of crowds, especially if you perform music a lot. That's something that probably you feel good with. For me, the reason I wrote open source is because I'm very shy, actually, in person. And the idea of trying to contribute to Bitcoin, a lot of that happens in open forums and open spaces, right? In GitHub and Twitter and all these things. And I get really nervous about it. I really do. But a friend was encouraging me, telling me that like, no one is judging you if you have a bad idea and then everyone tells you why it's a bad idea and you learn from that, you accept it. Like here you have this massive open party. Why are you not joining and contributing to something that could change the future just because you're scared? And so I wrote that, I guess, just as a reminder to myself that the whole point of open source is to dance and to not always try and be perfect all the time.
I think that's good advice for life in general. You
Right.
know, I think that's why it was such a relatable poem, because you could take it out of context from even the initial idea, and it's more of a universal theme, which is a great thing in a poem, because it can be interpreted many ways. And if you're, you know, having a certain kind of day or in a certain stage in your life, and you come across something, it can just really help you think through what you feel, you know. Like, I think that's what's so neat about poetry is you read it in a different way, you hear it in a different way, you come to it in a different mindset, you know.
Like music.
Yeah, music's similar. I find lyric writing to be the closest thing to, you know, trying to write poems, because really song lyrics are like poems to me. I tend to not write songs that are linear stories. Some people that have tried to write songs with me, they're like, Matt, what's this song about? And I'm like, oh, well, this is about a feeling I had when I was a child. And they're like, well, why does it have to do with taxi cabs and wine and losses?
Yeah.
And, you know, like, none of it makes any sense. And I'm like, it makes total sense to me. It's all these images and feelings, you know, and then I get feedback that people relate to the lyrics and stuff. And I'm like, oh, that's awesome.
I had a funny, you've been playing history with Zach in the band for like 12, 13, 14 years.
Yeah.
And I was just up in Seattle and explained to him what it was about, and he had no idea. He never knew what he was talking about. I mean, he's met your friend Dylan probably 30 times, hung out with him, and, you know, knows your whole history and everything, but he'd only ever really paid attention to the bass line.
That's true.
Like what he was supposed to do. I was like, do you listen to lyrics? He's like, no, man, I'm just like trying to keep up and jam. Like,
that's funny. I remember.
That's awesome.
Yeah, you telling me that. That was funny. Yeah, that's one of those songs that does have a specific meaning, but
often they don't.
The other thing I was thinking about, Leigh, was you know, as somebody who I assume you've traveled to Jerusalem and been in Israel and been around there in that part of the world, and how has that affected your outlook on the world? Or I know when I travel, when I've had travel in the past, I always feel like I'm learning something, or just my perspective will change slightly just by looking through the eyes of another people, you know, and just experiencing their stories, and just being around them physically is just, it's just something you can't replace that experience, you know, without doing it. And anything you wanted to share about that would be awesome.
Yeah, so I lived in Israel for a little bit over 4 years. Very short stint of that in Jerusalem, most of it in Tel Aviv, but I would work a lot in Jerusalem and a little bit in the West Bank as well. Yeah, definitely changed my perspective on a lot of things. I think the thing that would be most interesting and relevant for you guys is it changed a lot of my perspective about money in particular because of the situation in Jerusalem. So the way that it is, it's like Israel, the country, is pretty much in charge of Jerusalem. But there's whole sections of East Jerusalem that identify as Palestinian and do not have Israeli citizenship. They can give up their Jordanian citizenship, which is probably what they would travel with, and apply to become an Israeli citizen. But the downside of that is, let's say, for example, that you have a family. Recall that these are modern nation states, and that if your family has been in the area for 300 years, you might have property in Jordan and property in the West Bank and even maybe cousins in Gaza. And before this, there was no lines on that. And so there'd be no reason to think that you couldn't access those different assets and properties.
Right.
If you give up your Jordanian citizenship to become an Israeli citizen, your rights to your property that your family has in this other country diminish significantly. So you'll have families where literally some people are Israeli citizens and some people are Jordanian citizens and some people are undocumented based on their political alliances, but also on their needs. If you need to be getting a job and doing certain things in Tel Aviv, you're going to need to give up that Jordanian citizenship, and maybe your brother is going to be the one managing your property in Jordan. And the issue that creates for people in East Jerusalem, I'll try and be a little succinct about it, is that the Israeli banks run by Jews don't want to deal with you. I mean, literally, there were times where there were protests because there was a bank that was giving mortgages to Arabs.
Wow.
It's Americans are ashamed of their racism and pretend it doesn't exist. Israelis are not, and are very open about the fact that it exists. It's very common to have someone discriminate against Arabs very blatantly. You know, we won't do business with this person. We won't give a mortgage to this person, whatever it is. And but if you go to a Palestinian bank in Ramallah, for example, which is deeper in the West Bank and not in part of Jerusalem, they might tell you, you don't live in our jurisdiction. You live in the Israeli jurisdiction. So we're not going to give you a mortgage either. So you can have a lot of people that are unbanked and are holding their assets in a combination of dollars and Jordanian dinars and Israeli shekels because there is no Palestinian currency. So there's no currency where they actually control the monetary policy. The monetary policies they live with are all literally their enemies, the Israelis, or a foreign Hashemite king who is benevolent to them, but not really prioritizing their interests. Or, of course, the Americans who certainly do not prioritize their interests.
Right.
And just seeing like all the hoops that a lot of people had to jump through in order to do things that for me, my parents can very easily take a mortgage and buy a house and, you know, send me abroad to college and not have to think about who's going to be managing the funds for each of these and how are these funds going to be transferred, you know, which cousin are we going to tap? Like that made me think a lot about a global currency and how that could be incredibly valuable to people whose political interests are not being protected by their local bankers.
That's very well described. That really puts all those different factors into.
Yeah, right. It's complicated.
It sounds so complicated, and just that, forget about the regular struggle that life can be. Adding something so messed up. Racism and borders that used to not be there and all of that stuff. And how do you just money and like you said, unbanked, that really like you literally don't have a bank that you can use. You can't store your money safely. You can't so
A lot of people,
Or
there are a lot of Palestinians that do have banks, but they have to
yeah,
choose a side, right? Like you have to choose, these are the banks that I'm going to trust. I'm going to do all the paperwork for them and I'm going to have all the identification that they need. And that means I'm going to be excluded from this other bank. And like, I have the ability as an American, if I'm pissed at Wells Fargo, to just jump over to Chase and I don't have to think about my ID,
right.
So I definitely don't want to give the impression that Palestinians are, primitive or backwards. Like they're very sophisticated and they have a lot of different ways that they deal with these issues. And a lot of them do use Israeli banks. But for example, I know one company that one of the founders was Palestinian and one of the founders was a Jewish Israeli, and they tried to open a bank account together. And the bank gave them a runaround for like a year. And it got to the point where someone who was a friend of someone very high up at the bank called him up and was like, why are you guys doing this? Why can't these people operate a business together? And they're like, oh, we didn't like these two people doing business together. So we've just decided to throw paperwork after paperwork after paperwork, make you go to Ramallah, make you go to Haifa, make you do all of these things because we want to prevent a Jew and an Arab from cooperating together on owning a joint business bank account. And they eventually got the bank account when they went public about the reasons that it was not being opened. But imagine just trying to open a business and spending a year trying to figure out why you can't open a bank account.
No, yeah. That is very frustrating just to even ponder.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my gosh. And but we're so what brought you said you did 4 years there? Yeah. And then you came back to New York City?
Yes.
Yeah. And when you got back to New York City, was there is that when you started to, you were already writing as a freelance journalist at that point and doing that? Was that a hard transition coming back to New York? And
I didn't expect to have culture shock coming back to the country I came from, but I did. I'm from California. Everyone's much more laid back. And coming to New York, I thought all the editors hated me and everything was so expensive. Oh my gosh, compared to Middle Eastern prices. And I definitely had to get used to the way business is done here. In the Middle East, everything is very relationship oriented and it's very off the books. Like if I want an interview with someone, I need someone who knows him and knows me to vouch for me. And that's probably all I need. If I want to interview the CEO of a bank here in New York, I'm going to have several weeks of making through, legal needs to check the questions and all these things. And it doesn't mean that, Israeli banks just give quotes willy nilly, but we can make it up as we go. Like I can do the interview and then send him the quotes and then he'll let me know if there's a problem. For a lot of American companies, especially financial institutions, it's a very regimented and slow process to get the proper information.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that kind of makes sense. I can see that. I had a question pop into my head too. It's just jumping around here, sorry, but about when you were at Cointelegraph.
CoinDesk.
I mean, CoinDesk. Sorry.
Similar thing though.
I'll just blame the head on that one. When did anything stand out of people who were kind of anti or had strong opinions that were really against Bitcoin or against cryptocurrency or just pushback? I find myself being in a world where I'm just really like, I'm very optimistic about Bitcoin and I think it's, we don't have to go into that, but I'm just wondering if I'm missing some of the smart people that are kind of taking the other side and saying, wait, this is too fast, too soon. This is, not going to work. We're going to have to get some other kind of, I'm just, that other side.
So I think the most pushback that I've had so far with regards to Bitcoin happened during the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, which I went in January. And I was, as far as we know, I think the only crypto reporter to ever get into the WEF central building. But even if I wasn't the first, I was certainly the only one this year. And it was my job to run around asking all of these dignitaries and bankers and people from the SWIFT network and traditional finance and governance about Bitcoin. And let me tell you, there was no one who was less popular at the party than the girl who was asking everyone about Bitcoin. And I had a lot of pushback there. And the reasons seem basic, but are actually pretty accurate, although limited. So the problem with it is that like their criticisms are correct. They'll be like, this can be used for terrorism. Sure, it could. Their criticisms are, this is primarily used for gambling. Yes, it is. Their criticism is, this is a secret bank account that we cannot control. Correct. That is literally what this is. And central bankers were not super fond of that concept. But people seem to think it's because the central bankers are afraid of being dethroned, and they do not see Bitcoin at this point, at least most of them, do not see Bitcoin right now as a legitimate threat to their power. So it's not as if they're doing this criticism because they are afraid of Bitcoin. It's more like resistance to the world that Bitcoin would need to exist in, right? So we would need to have laws that accommodate for the fact that people hold a lot of their own wealth, that they can transact with that. Right now in the US, if you're using Bitcoin for small transactions, your tax paperwork is just a headache. And to rethink of a world in which you do not need to trust a bank, but choose to trust a bank is the world that they are resisting. And it has nothing to do with them thinking that Bitcoin itself is a threat. It's like that idea of that world. They think to themselves, we can't manage that world. And it is true that a huge amount of people that want that world want it in order to do things that the government doesn't like. On the other hand, something that I remember I was not debating, but conversing with a woman who is in charge of compliance technology for a lot of banks. And she was using these arguments, which are very rational arguments. For example, there's a lot of politicians in Eastern Europe, in particular Russia and the Ukraine, that have some association with organized crime, and they seem to be fans of Bitcoin. So they're like, hey, look, this can be used badly. And I'm like, this is very true. And so then I asked her, do you think that I have the right to, if I choose, have an abortion? And she said, of course I do. And I said, what if I'm in Saudi Arabia and I can't use my bank for that? And I'm not saying that that's a common use case, but just like the connecting the dots for her of like, oh, I understand this freedom of choice is not within the realm of terrorism and organized crime, that also applies to other things. Like I really saw like a light bulb turn on, and she was like, what other choices can people not make if a bank tells them no? The Jerusalem examples are some great examples. And they're just walking through all these different scenarios that aren't what people hear about in their boogeyman stories, usually would convert them to a conversation, which the last and most pragmatic criticism is governments will make this hard, which I agree is a very pragmatic criticism and something that we can be proactive about, supporting organizations like Coin Center. So those are all the criticisms, but I don't want to deflect it by saying like, oh, well, you know, that's not the purpose of Bitcoin, because who knows what the purpose of an open source software is. It will be the purpose that people use it for. I think the important thing that we can do when we hear criticism like that is to find and highlight the real cases where it's used in uplifting ways, and think about like, how can we make regulations that allow those uplifting use cases while keeping in mind that no government is going to be chill with terror financing. Like there's not something we're going to convince them to be okay with. So like understanding that dynamic is, I think, the biggest criticism that Bitcoin has from smart critics.
It's related to that, and not necessarily just at Davos, but in any of your conversations, we've obviously got a couple of US reps who sort of recognize or believe, depending on your point of view, that Bitcoin is unstoppable and will sort of, become a global currency and global reserve asset, whatever. Jeffson Davidson, I think, or anyway. Has there ever been anyone you've come across that's in sort of a multinational organization or sort of a global position of centralized power and that actually understands Bitcoin and what it's likely to become?
Oh, yeah.
There have been some of those conversations.
Yeah, some personally.
So like somebody at like BIS or somebody at Swift or somebody like that really gets it and knows it's coming.
But here's the thing. So this is what I find so interesting. Some of those are conversations I've had personally. Some of those are conversations that I know about and like saw, for example. that like weren't like direct just with me. There are a lot of world leaders and very powerful men who understand what Bitcoin is. They are usually smart enough to not say that they think it is going to be a dominant currency and they hold a lot of it. They are usually very, very measured in the way they talk about it. I will put, for example, Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. If you ever see his interviews about Bitcoin, is very clear on what this is. I don't know whether he holds or not. He doesn't say that he holds, but he's very clear on what this is and the value it has. And he does not give those interviews in English and does not promote them very much, which makes me think he's even smarter. There are definitely people at organizations like you mentioned, SWIFT and central banks and things like that, that I've been deeply impressed with their ability to describe Bitcoin, but will be very, very cautious if you ask them if they own any or if they think that it will be used in their country, for example. I believe it's the finance minister of France also is extremely, if not knowledgeable, then well rehearsed in the way that he can describe Bitcoin. The person in charge of monetary policy and central banking in Singapore, my God, blew me away. He gets it. He really, really gets it. That does not mean that these people are going to promote local policies that are good for Bitcoin, because maybe that doesn't serve their best interest. But there's lots of world leaders that get it.
I'm so not surprised, as we've seen with, you know, Michael Saylor, when someone with a lot of experience and, you know, a lot of high functioning neurons firing between his ears gets a hold of this thing and actually spends the time. It doesn't take long to recognize what it is, given how much content there is out now versus maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago.
Yeah.
So you have to imagine that just like these executives are getting turned on to it at all these companies, it has to be the same way in governments. And yeah, it can't be too long before some of that stuff starts to leak. Like, I'm going to hit you up for one of these, you know, one of these Hebrew language interviews, and we'll get it translated after this.
It's very, very short. I mean, it's extremely short. Like
Yeah.
all he's saying is like, he explains what like they ask him, do you know what Bitcoin is? And he says it back in 2 sentences correctly.
Right. I love that the Putin one from 2018, I think, when he's, you know, essentially just laughing at the idea of a Fed coin and saying like that wouldn't be a cryptocurrency.
But that's exactly what Bibi said as well.
Yeah.
Like they understand the concept that the central bank digital currencies that everyone is super jazzed about right now, it's the new black, are not even remotely close to Bitcoin. And they understand what Bitcoin is, that it's outside of them.
Yeah.
I will say, so when I was working in Israel, that was 2014. And I know that there were already, I don't think it's like a secret, both the US, a lot of militaries around the world were starting to have educational courses related to Bitcoin because they were concerned about terror financing. So that was 6 years ago. You know, governments have been aware of Bitcoin for a long time and have been watching how it's being used for a long time. And I don't think that they are going to be caught off guard and shocked as their like power is revoked. I think that we're very steadily seeing people paying more attention to it as they realize it impacts their specific interests.
A related thing is just, you know, as I've gotten deeper into the space and been introduced to people and just heard stories, I mean, the executive ranks of all the large tech companies and all the large banks are filled with people with massive stacks of Bitcoin already.
Some of them, yeah.
I mean, by filled with, I mean, there's a good number of people. There's a huge number of people with those jobs. So you can get to a large number, even if it's 10% or 25% or whatever. But like, there are a ton of executives at, you know, PayPal, at Facebook, at Google, at Amazon, at Microsoft, you know, at Apple, at JP Morgan, Goldman, like they have huge stacks of Bitcoin individually as humans. So, you know, in the US, at least, it just feels like, you know, that ship has sailed and there's just going to be more than enough funding for lawyers to launch, you know, freedom of speech arguments, code of speech arguments against any sort of 6102 order. I just don't see it happening.
But and on the same line, that there's a lot of people at these major banks, institutions stacking Bitcoin. Every company that you've heard of that is doing surveillance software, every company that you've heard of that is doing more problematic applications of software, they're probably interested in Bitcoin too. So what do you have when you have a revolution in which everyone is for themselves and the people who are making the tools against cypherpunks are also either, you can say, claiming to be, or you can say view themselves as cypherpunks? It's not this clear divide between us versus them, bankers versus Bitcoiners. There's actually this really nuanced and kind of I'm not going to say problematic, but it makes you think, like, how does someone who has these ideals and holds these kinds of assets build software like this and do things like this? And does that mean that the whole reason Bitcoin exists, being able to hold it yourself and transact with some level of not anonymity, but pseudonymity with your addresses, will disappear as the people who understand how that technology works makes tools to help control capital flow, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's a much deeper conversation, I think, about, the two things that Bitcoin could fix, right? One is, private transactions, and the other is, sound money. And
Yeah.
I think sound money solves much larger global problems for way more people. And privacy will have to be worked out, alongside it, and will have to fit into the nature of what Bitcoin ended up being, which
Yeah.
is sound money. Luckily it's technology, and you can build things into it, and you can build things on top of it and around it. And, privacy is a spectrum, as our friend Matt Odell always says. And,
Yes.
As Gladstein and crew always fight for. And I think you'll see tons and tons of technologies that aid people who need to keep their transactions private, and private networks that transact with Bitcoin. But it doesn't have to necessarily, immutable, making sure there's no double spend, making sure there's always, super easy to calculate that, yes, in fact, there's only 21 million still. Like, those are the things that are much more important and take this, power of the printing press away from centralized, corrupt cabals of people in governments, and now scarily multinational organizations trying to create IMF SDR coin or whatever
Yes.
horrible Frankenstein thing they're cooking up.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is interesting. What do you see as sort of the next 5-10 years of Bitcoin? What are you kind of looking forward to, or what do you think might happen? What are some of your pet forecasts?
My pet forecast. So I won't imagine that I can look 10 years into the future of Bitcoin, because that's far. Who knows? I will say that I am fairly confident Bitcoin will not disappear and lose all of its value in the next 5 years. That may sound like a very tempered statement, but it's actually a very strong one. That means it's money right now, and it's going to, in my personal observation and opinion, continue to be money for several years. The big thing that will be interesting to watch, but scares me and makes me very curious, is we saw in Iran, when it became more popular for domestic transactions, the government very quickly made a lot of that illegal, which doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It just means there's more risks with using it. And in other ways, dealt with more cumbersome reporting. They really stepped in and took control of the mining industry. So we see that when there is quick adoption, there is quick reaction. And I think that over the next 10 years, we will see whether that continues to balance itself out, in terms of Bitcoin is still relatively useful in Iran, but much less so than it was before the government took considerable notice of it. Will Bitcoiners be able to keep that usefulness as governments become more and more focused on it? Because it is very young as a technology. It is not invincible, it is strong. And there are certain things that could certainly weaken it. And that doesn't mean that the entire network would collapse. If it becomes too risky and difficult for marginalized users to use, then the gambling use case becomes really the primary thing that it is, right? So protecting that cypherpunk value as it continues to evolve and government reaction to it continues to evolve, I think is the big question of the next decade. It will continue to be money. And the question is, money for who, and money where, and money how? these are the questions over the next 10 years?
Yeah. The only thing I'd take issue with there is I think you should sub in savings technology for gambling, because that appears to be the main thing that it's used for. The last few years, that's been the dominant narrative and the dominant use case that's taken over Bitcoin education and, toxic maximalists or
That's very
whatever.
fair.
Like, it really is Bitcoin as a savings technology, the soundest, hardest money ever. It's not the reason that people are holding it in their corporate treasuries. It's not for gambling.
I completely
they're not
agree.
trading, right? They're
But no
doing
one's
it
going to
because it's hard
outlaw
money.
savings, right? Like the
Exactly.
narrative that they're going to come at us with is not, oh, it's savings, so we got to outlaw that. They're going to say, oh, look, it's gambling. We should restrict this. So
Even that would be low on the list behind terrorism and all the other
True.
things, though.
Yeah.
I think the
I do
money
think it's
laundering
good
thing is the
savings.
thing. Yeah, that's what I'm in it for. Is just I just think it's the best savings technology we've ever had to be able to transfer value across time, across space, across these different weird national borders that make no sense, and and pass it on to your kids, as we sort of started the conversation.
Yeah, I want to add something to that agrees with what you're saying. I do not believe that terra financing is a primary use case of Bitcoin. I do not believe it's a very effective use case for Bitcoin. I covered a little bit the Terra beat when I was reporting in the Middle East. And so when I came to Bitcoin, I came with a lot of that expertise, and I was really looking for that. Like, that's what everyone keeps talking about is a big boogeyman. So I wanted to find that boogeyman. And there are some rare outlier use cases for like this, but honestly, it's really not. The US dollar, like banks, these are much more common tools to be used for that kind of crime. So I think that this narrative that they've built up around Bitcoin as for terra financing is false, actually, and that saving, even if saving is maybe less popular than trading, saving is way more popular than all of these things that they tell us to be afraid of.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Matty G, any final thoughts for Leigh? I know we've got to wrap up here in a minute.
I know. This has been a great conversation. I feel like I've learned a lot. And I was just going to ask Leigh, one of my favorite things about talking to poets and musicians and stuff is to just like get a reference or get like, because we all have our kind of our group of heroes or the people that inspired us to get into stuff, or that we still go back and read. And I'm not going to ask you for a whole bunch of them, but maybe just a poet or two that really maybe a new name for me to check out.
Yeah, definitely. So I highly recommend looking up the translations of a woman named Maram al-Masri. Maram is M-A-R-A-M, Al-A-L, Masri is M-A-S-R-I. She is a Syrian poet in exile in France, I believe. And she writes amazing love poems. But one of the things that really inspires me about her is she has actually received like threats for her poetry. Her poetry has been very political, outspoken against the Assad regime.
Mm-hmm.
And more than that, she's a woman from a very dominantly Muslim country writing about love and romance, and sometimes about love and romance between Christians and Muslims. And so this, on top of the stuff where she's talking about the rights of her people, has made her incredibly controversial in some circles. And I mean, some people really, she was at one point in danger, and she kept writing anyway. And she just kept saying like, they're trying to make a war against me and my freedom of speech, and I'm not going to cow to that, and continued to publish poetry books. And I just think that's so badass. So I would highly recommend the poetry of Maram al-Masri.
Can you spell the last name one more time?
Mm-hmm. A-L, and then maybe like a dash or a space. Yeah. Masri, so M-A-S-R-I.
Okay, I have it. I just wanted to check. Thank you so much.
I have one more poetry related question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Leigh, you know that we have quite the video and content and social media team.
Yeah.
Could I take your poem and give it to Brady and Brecky and let them make a video out of it with some imagery?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. All right. We'll let you take a look at it, and if you like it, we'll put it out there in the world, however we mutually agree to do so.
Thank you so much for having me today,
I really liked it. It was great.
This was fun.
Yeah.
It was really fun, and thank you so much, and best of luck with your future endeavors. It sounds like you got a lot going on, and we'll be following here from our world headquarters.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Great.
And I hope you feel better soon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Leigh.
Take care. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Well, that was fun, Matt.
Yeah.
What a great guest.
That was a great guest.
Yeah. We're still alive. So
yeah.
Anything else you want to talk about before we drop?
I'm good. Do we know what's next on tap here? Do we got another guest lined up? Or
I mean, we're back. We're back, baby.
Okay, good.
Yeah. So we'll, kick around some ideas. We'll get somebody good on soon. I'm excited to see that. I'm dead serious. That poem was awesome. And I really want to see it with some music and some words and some images on screen, and just give it to our crazy creatives and see what they can make out of it, and put it out on Bitcoin Twitter and see what happens. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. I think that's a great idea. Good call.
Yeah. Well, you always try to get the yes on air. It's harder later. You basically always put people on the spot, and they don't want to disappoint the audience.
I don't want to be that guy.
Yeah, this is Peter McCormick, who has the What Bitcoin Did podcast, keeps on ambushing CEOs of large crypto exchanges on his show, and getting them to commit to fund Bitcoin Core developers, open source developers. He did it to Brian Armstrong from Coinbase. He just did it to the Winklevi. It's the best. They can't say no on air.
That's awesome. What a good technique.
Anyway, so cheers Pedro for that tactic. That worked out well with Leigh's poem as well. Well, good, man. It's great to see you. Everybody knows what's up and why we've been off air for a little bit. You look great, sound great.
Good.
Yeah, man. We'll do this again soon, and I can't wait to see you here in SoCal soon. I guess. Shoot,
that's right.
8 days away. I'll see you in 8 days.
8 days away. I'm coming down.
In Palm Springs.
See you in person. Yeah.
All right. Sounds good. Well, love you, bro.
Love you
Bright
too,
Orange
brother.
Future.
Bright Orange
Signing
Future.
off.
Whoa.